Hello everybody, my name is Mackenzie Lloyd, and today I'm going to be talking about humor in speeches. I'm going to be addressing the different ways that humor can be used to reinforce topics used in presentations, such as creating a bond with the audience, engaging the audience, as well as helping make sure that everybody is engaged in one central idea throughout the entire presentation. I first want to identify different problem areas that may come along the way with humor. Humor is something that needs to be judged based on demographic and audience needs. It does not need to be something that is just thrown into a presentation. It most of the time cannot be rehearsed. It really needs to be something that is just spontaneous and thrown out there. I watched many TED Talks leading up to this presentation, and I realized that people who tried too hard, it made it distracting on the viewer, and I found that it made the audience focus more on the humor and the jokes that they used instead of focusing on the actual meat of the presentation. For my speech, I'm going to be using an example, and my example will be a rocket scientist is going to be speaking to middle school students. These middle school students, for the sake of this presentation, have no background information whatsoever on the rocket scientist. They don't know what he does for work, they don't know how they do it, and that is going to be the humor. So we're first going to be talking about how he creates the bond between the middle school students and himself. He's going to start out by going into the classroom, and he is going to first ask the children to stereotype him. He's going to be addressing the fact that there are stereotypes within the field of work that he does, and as well as the students. So he first asks the students to stereotype him, and the students give the feedback of him being nerdy, boring, and slightly eccentric, which is strange. And so he then says, well, let me go ahead and stereotype you. And he immediately addresses the fact that they are troublesome, they are loud, and they are sometimes pretty needy. So the middle school students retain the humor from it without going too far off topic by saying he is not just a boring guy, and he doesn't just do boring things for a living. So then he goes on to talk about how the scientists gave the stereotype to students and how rambunctious and troublesome they were, but they also understood what he was saying. The point in me giving that example was that the humor was used in a way to engage the audience, as well as create a bond at the same time, and the specific reason it did both very well. And that is one of the best ways to use humor in your speeches. Another reason is to help the audience retain information, such as key points and different main topics that you've had. So the scientist speaking about the way that he calculates the information used to put ejection buttons into rockets, right? So out of that, these students got ejection button. All right, whenever they think of ejection button, they're going to think about their TV shows, they're going to think about their movies that they watch, the cartoons, and the comedy behind it. They're going to remember watching those TV shows and those movies and those episode cartoons, and they are going to remember how funny it was to see these people fly out of their cars or fly out of their spaceships. All right, so he says that instead of using the word calculates, he's going to use the word math problems. Instead of using the word release from the rocket ship, he's going to say ejected, because they know what an ejection button is. And so that way you're identifying your audience and you're incorporating it into your speech without distracting from the topic. So he just used the ejection button reference to help the children retain the information and come back to the main point without leading them too far off the wrong path. It sparked their interest, and they were able to see that through. The next thing that he did was keep the audience engaged. And at this point, the audience is engaged because he is using terms that the students have heard, and he is using terms that these students have listened to in the past. And using humor in speeches is not something that everybody's going to learn right off the bat. It is not something that is easy to understand always. You have to be a certain type of demographic to understand all types of humor, and that's why whenever people use these types of humor in speeches, it's sometimes hard if the speaker doesn't correctly identify the audience and their needs for engagement. Most listeners are looking for strategy in their speakers. So I was watching a bunch of TED Talks before I had made this video, and I saw that in each of their videos they kept referencing the fact that humor didn't always come easy to them, and some of the jokes that they would make were only funny to them, so they thought that they were doing what was right, but they initially were not. And so with our rocket scientist, he couldn't make too many jokes for these students because he didn't understand completely he didn't understand what they understood. And I think that was the hardest part for the scientist to combat, because he wasn't sure on their previous knowledge of what he did. And so he had to break down everything because they might have been completely oblivious to what he was saying. So he was able to keep the audience engaged, and he was able to use these jokes to help the students recall information maybe that they were asked about in the future, but he understood exactly what they were saying. Another thing that I was listening to on these TED Talks were that the people that were using the humor had to practice. You know, it's not a structured thing where they put these humorous texts into their speeches and they memorize them in order. It's more of, they would say something, but they would also react with something else funnier. So they would make a blank statement and they would come back and say something else. So instead of saying that maybe the audience didn't understand what they were saying and so they didn't laugh, he would say, maybe I'm too funny for them. It would be a humorous reaction to a blank statement. And that is one of the things that most of these humor speakers would use. And with that, they also had to understand everything that they were having to put into these speeches had to be understood by the audience. And the audience, I had talked about a lot in this presentation, but it is the key factor in humor. And if you don't understand your audience, you're unable to move forward through your presentation and expect them to learn everything. And so that is one of the negative things, is that you also have to understand exactly what they're saying without understanding their prior knowledge and maybe understanding where they're coming from or what they do for a living. You're not able to completely make that bond, make that bridge across whatever your differences are. And so with all of this being said, I want to summarize and just say that humor is something that is not always taken lightly and that needs to be watched out for based on audience, based on demographics, based on setting. And that is all I have for my speech. Thank you so much.